Hey, how's it going, guys? Welcome back. Lecture 2.3, Chapter 2, third lecture. So, we're really going to carry on from, we're going to still be in that descriptive research kind of section. So again, we're not really talking yet about hypotheses or experiments, but these are other approaches that can kind of give you a sense of what something looks like. Again, I always like that, what it is, not why it is. So we're not talking about why it is yet, just sort of what it is. And so these are approaches for doing this, and we're going to talk about two here, two different approaches, case studies and surveys. Cool. All right, so let's jump in with the case study kind of thing. So again, just reminding you again, exactly, this is just the part from the textbook where I just want to be clear that we are in this descriptive research section, and that these methods, do the what it is, not why it is. There's the four. We're going to do the last two. All right, so just connecting with the previous one, case studies and surveys. So let's talk case studies. Case studies were extremely popular, and they still can be. They still certainly are used quite a bit. And really what a case study involves is focusing very specifically on maybe just one given individual. That's the most common sense. But it could also be a group or an event, but sort of a one-off thing. So rather than, comparing 5 different individuals and how they react to something, we're focusing on just one individual, one event, one group, and so it's a case. That thing is a case. So think of a medical doctor having a number of different cases, each are representing an individual, right? And so focusing on that individual. But you can also, if we take that analogy a step further, just understand how it can get a little more complex. Let's imagine a detective working a number of cases. But in a detective case, it's not really an individual. It's a collection of facts and whatever. It could be some crime that happened somewhere, and that is the case. But it's that one case again, if you want to dive into the details of that. You're going to get a much better sense as we give you a couple of examples. The idea is, from that one case, if you can learn a lot in a very rich way, you can potentially generalize that to other cases or other situations. You'll see examples of that. And it really does sometimes allow the researchers to learn about something that you just can't really learn about in a typical experimental approach. Okay, so again, all of these things will make more sense. In fact, I think I'll skip back to this slide right after doing a couple of examples just to reaffirm these points and make sure you're clear on them. So I'll follow the textbook here, and so one of the cases, at least for this first one of the cases that they describe is HM, a very famous case, by the way, with a lot of Toronto and, in fact, Canadian ties. Brenda Milner, a very famous neuropsychologist from Montreal, did a lot of work with HM, as did a number of psychologists here at University of Toronto, including Endel Tulving, did a lot of work with HM. He's still doing research at the Rotman Research Institute. So HM was a really interesting case. So let me give you the background story so it makes sense, why he even agreed to do what he did. All right. When HM was young, and so actually, let me just mention, I'm using this HM. You can find his name. He's Henry. You can find all details. But typically with case studies, we don't give people's names. We do initials. HM is the famous, set of initials for him, because we're going to give a lot of details about his life and stuff. And there was some protection of privacy, essentially, that's involved in these case studies. So we don't typically give the full name. Now, HM became such a famous case that he became known, and this whole story became known. So the story begins when he was a young child, and he started having epileptic seizures. Now, to understand why they kind of went the direction they did, let me make sure you understand how seizures work, first of all. So in a seizure, a part of the brain on one side sends a signal to that same part of the brain on the other side. Okay, and of course the brain is sending signals all the time, but the issue that can cause epilepsy is when there becomes what we call a feedback loop. So let's say, part of the brain sends a signal to that one, which sends it right back. And when that happens, what you can get is a short circuit essentially happening, that the signal, as it gets sent back and forth, becomes stronger and stronger. And these signals are electrical, and they start to involve other brain regions. They start to activate other brain regions as this electrical signal strengthens and strengthens and strengthens. Eventually, they can cause the person to fall down, to lose the ability to stand up straight as the brain starts doing this. And the part of the brain that you'll learn about more as we go through, called the motor strip. There's a part of the brain that controls our body, and that starts getting electrified. So a lot of this electrical activity starts to stimulate that, and that's why the person shows seizures while they're laying on the ground and their body is, we'd say convulsing or jerking. What that is their brain getting activated, and the parts of their brain that control their body is getting activated, and that's why the body is doing what it's doing. Right? It's a reflection of that brain activity. Now, seizures are socially very uncomfortable, right? They can be dangerous, first of all, because you can harm yourself while you're in there. But even danger aside, imagine you're on the subway and you have a seizure, and you maybe even lose consciousness for a moment, and then you wake up on the floor of the TTC with a bunch of people looking down at you saying, "Are you okay? Is things all right?" And imagine now that might happen to you a number of times a day. That's what kind of happened to HM. His seizures got worse and worse, more and more regular. And for some people, you may have heard about agoraphobia, the fear of big spaces, of going out. Well, sometimes people have that fear for another reason. And HM was he didn't want to go out, didn't want to do anything, because he never knew when a seizure would strike. And he didn't enjoy them striking while he was in public. Okay, so it became a point where it was really negatively affecting his life because of the frequency and the severity of the seizures. And so he was willing to consider some extreme things. One of the extreme things that a surgeon suggested is what's called the bilateral removal of his hippocampal formation. So this is for HM. There's something in here called the hippocampus. It's actually, you'll see it later. It doesn't... Here it just looks like a mob of brain tissue, but it's actually kind of a cool shaped little structure in the brain. But nobody knew what the hippocampus did, but that was the area that was producing the seizures. That's where his seizures were coming from, was sort of the signal being sent back and forth between these areas. So the surgeons, who don't really understand the brain very well, said the following thing: "Listen, Henry, we're pretty sure that if we remove these parts of the brain," and this is what HM's brain looked like afterwards, "if we remove these two hippocampal structures, we're pretty sure your seizures will completely stop. However, we have no idea what these parts of the brain do, and we have no idea what other side effects are going to come. Do you want to do this?" So this is what we call psychosurgery, removing parts of the brain. It was more common before we had a lot of drugs to control a lot of the symptomology. And it's one way, right? Once you remove part of the brain, you don't go back. And so it's a big decision. Henry M. decided to go with it. He had those parts of the brain removed. The good news is his seizures stopped immediately. I should have turned off Slack. If you hear a little woodpecker sound every now and then, that's Slack messages coming in. Sorry. Okay, so he had this part of the brain removed. At first, it seemed like he was okay. It took a while for them to realize the problem that then became the defining problem of HM's life, and that was he could not lay down new memories. So we're going to talk about amnesias when we get to the memory chapter, but there's two kinds of amnesias. There's the ones we often think about, which is called retrograde amnesia. That's when you lose your past, right? So if you're in a car accident or something, I sometimes call it soap opera amnesia, right? Because this is what they show on soap operas. Somebody has an accident and they forget who they are and where they live, and they forget that they were married, so they marry somebody else, and then eventually they find out they were already married, and all that stuff happens in soap operas, right? So that's losing the past. Something happens and you've lost everything that was before that. The other form and this is what HM has, is what we're going to call anterograde amnesia. He remembered his past fine. He could remember everything pre-surgery fine, but from the day of surgery onward, he couldn't seem to lay down any new memories. So if you came and saw HM after his surgery, you could talk to him. He would seem like an intelligent, it would seem perfectly fine. He wouldn't have any trouble conversing with you. But if you then left the room and then came back into the room, HM would feel like he never met you and you never talked. That whole record of your conversation with him would never be stored in memory, and he will never remember it. Okay, so that's anterograde amnesia. So this is a case study, first of all. Let's just be clear. So one person that this ever happened to. So when we talk about, learning things that you couldn't maybe learn from an experiment, well, this isn't a procedure we're going to want to do to a lot of people, right? Especially now that we know what it does. This is pretty severe to lose your memory for events going forward. And so we learned a lot, though, right? We learned a lot about the hippocampus and what it does for us all. It's obviously a very important structure to help us lay down new memories. And without it, we can't. And so we learn a lot from studying this case. And in fact, HM is known as the most researched case participant, certainly in psychology. He had a ton of experiments done on him after the fact to try to learn about what other capabilities he might have lost. There are problems with case studies, by the way, and the textbook mentions this with HM, that everybody did these studies, they found all the things that he wasn't very good at now, and they attributed all those things to the hippocampus. Okay, it's because he has no hippocampus. But we learned after his death that he also had some damage to his frontal lobes in his brain. And it's possible that some of the deficiencies may have been due to the frontal lobe loss and not the hippocampal loss. Those are the sorts of things that make case studies complicated, right? You're making your inferences based on one person, and there's always other details involved in that person. Okay, so that's one case. Let me just mention, if you like case studies, they are very interesting. So I'm going to mention this book, Oliver Sacks, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And I'm going to suggest this might be a little bit of companion reading you might want to do during this course. First of all, let me walk you through a little bit. So one of the reasons why I would suggest that is this is a bunch of brief little chapters. It's like you can read a chapter before bed. They are all neuropsychology cases. Oliver Sacks is a doctor. He's a neuropsychologist. So first of all, what is neuropsychologist? You guys have probably heard a lot about neuroscience. So neuroscience is all about, the brain in action, and you probably think of things like fMRIs, watching the brain as different parts send signals around, and et cetera, et cetera. So neuroscience is really how we understand the brain now. And we have all these great tools for watching the brain in action, like fMRIs and EEGs and other systems. But we didn't have those tools a while ago. And early on, when people were trying to understand the brain and what all the parts of it did, kind of remember Broca? Learning that little part of the brain was important for productive language. People started to look at brain damage. Okay, they started to find brain damaged people interesting, and so just to give you an example of this, the war, World War I and World War II, while they were horrible on so many levels, to the neuropsychologists, they were kind of an opportunity because people were getting shot in the head and surviving. And so that means different parts of their brain, depending on where they got shot, were damaged, which is sort of like a natural HM study, right? We didn't surgically remove that part of the brain, but that part of the brain is now gone. And so now we can study these people as cases and learn how they have changed. How has their behavior changed? How have their abilities changed? So neuropsychology was really the science of doing that. Find people who for various reasons had suffered brain injury. Another common example was anoxia. People in showers that used propane to drive the showers or something, sometimes this would go wrong and there wouldn't be enough oxygen in the room. They would actually pass out for lack of oxygen, and when you have a lack of oxygen, brain tissue dies. But if they get rescued before they die, the person, then they can survive, but some of their brain tissue can be damaged, and that would be another example where a neuropsychologist would now be, oh, I'm kind of interested in what you can no longer do without that brain tissue. And so we started to learn, oh, if this part of the brain is damaged, we see this happen. If that part of the brain is damaged, so I'll give you an example. If the very back of your head, the part of the brain at the very back of your head is damaged, you're going to have vision problems. So we now know this as primary visual cortex. This is where all of our visual information comes through the eyes and comes to the back of the brain first before going to the rest of the brain. But if you have damage back there, you're going to have visual issues. So damage in different areas gives rise to different things. That's what this book is about. Chapter after chapter will be damage to a different area, and it'll be a story about some patient and how they are, what they behave, including the man who mistook his wife for a hat. He had something called visual agnosia. So a great little book to read. Sachs is a great writer, really interesting. And as you read, you'll be learning a little bit more about the brain and psychology in a fun, interesting way. Okay. Neuropsychology is all about the cases. You'll see case after case here, and really mapping the damage to functional changes or deficits, emotional or psychological symptoms. Maybe the person seems different now, acts different, the consequences on behavior, activities, and participation. Okay, I'm going to very quickly just jump back here and say, okay, here's a couple of cases now. You get the idea. We get a person often and focus on them and really try to learn how something that makes them unique, has changed the way they behave in the world. From that case, like HM, we understand what his hippocampus seemed critical for, and we're kind of learning that, hey, other people, this could be relevant too. Let me give you one example of this. There was another syndrome called Korsakoff syndrome that people started to note. It's another situation where people were showing that same sort of amnesia, that anterior grade amnesia. And what it turned out was it was caused by the fact that a lot of people in Russia at the time did not have very much food to eat. They were surviving on vodka. They were drinking a lot of vodka, and that's where they were getting all their calories to keep their body alive. But what they weren't getting is certain vitamins. And it turns out the hippocampus requires one of these vitamins, and if you're not getting it, your hippocampus will wither and die. That's what was happening to those Korsakoff's patients. So we kind of, from HM, we can kind of say, oh, maybe it's the hippocampus. And sure enough, when they looked at the hippocampus, that was where the damage was. So if you're going to try to subsist on alcohol, at least take some vitamins with it. Okay, that's bad advice from intro psych. And of course here, let's researchers examine something impossible to conduct via experiment. That's what neuropsychologists, they dealt with patients who had things happen to them that you would never want to happen to anybody. So experimentally, you're not going to do this to anybody. But if it does happen to them, then you might take advantage to look at the effects of that. And so it gives you an opportunity to study things that would be hard to study otherwise. Okay. So I think you have a good sense for case studies. Here's just another case study. I forgot about this one. One of the earliest ones, if you're interested in memory at all, there's this book called The Mind of the Mnemonist. What's a mnemonist? A mnemonist is someone that's really good at memorizing everything. And this is a story about a doctor named Luria who found this person who could do this. They remembered almost every detail of everything. So the opposite of HM. And the question is how? What's going on? How are they able to do it? Because they could do it very effortlessly. And it turns out that person in this book had something called synesthesia. Synesthesia this happens to about 1 or 2% of people, and it's the idea that when you see something, so imagine this was really written in black. Okay, but to a synesthete, it might look like you're seeing here, where certain letters have a color associated with them, or a sound sometimes, so synesthesia is known as a crossing of the senses. So think something that should be visual and should be just shape like a letter, you're also getting color. Or maybe you're getting sound, or maybe you're getting a textural feel. Like some synesthetes will say certain names are like rivers, whereas other names are like gravel falling on their head. I don't know, but they feel it. I mean, they're not just saying that like a poet would say it, but they actually sense, they experience that, and whatever they experience. And I'll give you just one study on synesthetes. They were shown in one study in Waterloo. They were given a number, and the synesthetes would say, "I see a certain color when I see that number." And they were given a palette from PowerPoint, and they're saying, okay, add the red, green, and blue until it matches what you see. Show us what you see. And they could do that. They could match a color and create sort of that color and say, that's what I see, when I'm looking at this. Imagine, again, this was all really black. Then they brought them back to the lab months later, and they asked them to do the same thing, to say, would they actually produce the same color? And they do. So we believe the synesthetes when they tell us. They are seeing, colors associated with whatever, and for whatever reason, that tends to produce really strong memory of events. So this is a case that kind of gets you thinking about what is going on here and how can we understand this better. And so we often do, use case studies to examine exceptional situations. So it could be negative exceptional situations like the neuropsychology, but it could also be these, people who are capable of amazing feats. These children who can play, sometimes often autistic children who can play amazing musical pieces at 4 years old or something like this. How does that work? And so case studies we will use to study those. Okay, got a little more hung up on case studies than I imagined. Let's just jump to surveys. The textbook talks about surveys quite a bit, and you went through that Trust in Science survey. And again, the reason I wanted you to go through it, if you haven't gone through it yet, please go up and pause right now, go up and do that, and then come back. If you haven't done it yet, what I wanted you to get was a real experience after, either before or after you read that section on surveys, so that when you do read it, you can actually say, oh, yeah, that's right. That's how it felt. And so first of all, what are the advantages of surveys? Well, there's really one big advantage. It allows you to get a lot of data in a short period of time, right? And that's why everybody wants us to answer their surveys. They get hundreds of people giving them a lot of data really effectively. So it's a efficient way to collect data. But there are some worries and there are some disadvantages. How much can you trust that data? So first of all, and the textbook talks about this quite a bit, it's sensitive to word effects. It's really important how you ask the questions. The example it gave in the textbook was something about the British Parliament was interested at some point in how people felt about Britain having nuclear weapons as a deterrent. And they were, in one survey, asked whether they felt safe now that Britain also had nukes. In a different one, they asked whether they felt safer now that Britain had nukes. When they used safer, the number was much, much higher than when they used the word safe. Which makes sense, right? Like safer is not as extreme as safe. You can feel safer and not feel safe. So it makes sense that little difference would matter. However, often when people are reporting the results of surveys, they don't highlight those nuances. They just say, hey, this many people feel safe. And they don't necessarily, they used whatever word they used, and they often talk about it in a more general sense, but often the specific questions you ask really determine the results you get. And so anytime you hear some bizarre results on a survey, my first thought is, can I see the question people actually were asked? I want to see the actual question before I get too worried or excited about that. The actual words matter a lot. There's a whole lot of worry around participant motivation. So this is what I kind of wonder for you when you did that Trust in Science questionnaire. By the way, did you notice in that Trust in Science questionnaire, did it ever feel like they're kind of asking me the same question over and over again? It's just subtly different, but it's sort of the same thing. They're really just asking, do I trust scientists? They just found 21 different ways of asking that. Sometimes they will have different forms, different wordings to try to get rid of some of these wording effects. And another thing you might have noticed, though, is that some of those questions are worded in a normal way and some of them in a reversed. What do I mean by that? Well, if you are someone who trusts scientists, some of the questions would have you now answering hi. So it would say something like, I trust a scientist when they say X or Y. And then you might be on the real agree side, right? Heavy agree. But other times they're worded in a reversed way, where if you trust science, you're going to pick a low number. So it would be something like this. Scientists often like to deceive the public about what their research says. So if you trust scientists, you're not going to agree with that. You're going to disagree, right? So what are they doing there? Why do they have these reversed ones? They want you to read and think about the question, and they want to be able to detect people who are not. If people are just doing hi for every question, then you can detect that. You can say, oh, they're not showing any sensitivity to when we reverse the questions, because they should be sort of flipping where they're at. So if that's what's happening, they're not even reading the questions. What they're worried about there is motivation. And all of us, when we go through a survey, it's like, oh, okay, kind of going through a survey, click, 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 click. We're not really like, oh, I want to give the best data I can give. I want to think about this deeply and give a really, really accurate answer. And so they try to use things like reverse questions to push us that way a little bit, to make us think about things a little bit. The third disadvantage that I want to highlight and use just as something to go out a little bigger is this is a reliance on subjective data. So we're almost all the way back to Wundt in a way. The Wundt issue, the introspection sort of issue, never went away. We continue in psychology every now and then to want to know, to ask people, how do you feel about something? What do you think about something? Surveys are introspection tools, right? They're not asking someone to introspect about their consciousness the way Wundt was, but we are asking them to introspect on their opinions, on their beliefs, on their whatever, to kind of think about it and then tell us how they feel. And so it is what's called a subjective measure. So a subjective measure is anything that's based on personal opinion, judgment, feelings, or point of view, right? This is somebody telling us what they think or feel or whatever. We have no way of knowing how accurate that is. We just have to sort of trust them, and scientists are not big on trust, which is kind of ironic with the trust of science thing. But anyway, scientists like hard data. So that means objective. So what's an objective measure? It's factual, based on observations and measurements. Scientists love things you can measure directly. Now, a survey kind of gives you the impression of getting an objective measure, right? So we have people go through that trust in science questionnaire. And we can, and I think I will, by the way. I think I'll show you the distribution of where where our class is in terms of trust. So some people will be very trusting, some not so much. We can see how they're split. And we could calculate an average. We could say this class on average has a trust in science of 8.2. I don't know what that means. I'll have to find out what that stuff means, but I'll do that for you. And so it feels like we've measured trust objectively, but we haven't. We've really measured it subjectively. But the survey allows us to go from that subjective to the kind of thing we can do stats on, to measurements, to numbers. But it's still always, at its core, is a subjective measure. And always, some psychologists will not totally trust anything that's happened. They worry about things like the wording effects and the motivation and the accuracy of the reporting. And so therefore, surveys are sometimes seen as a good way to kind of start thinking about something, to learn about an area, to kind of figure out what people's opinions or thoughts are. But it's not a place to end. It really just sort of gives you an idea of things that you should study right, where right means doing a proper experiment and getting as objective a measurement of what you're interested in as possible. Okay, so that's why sort of all of these things, case studies, surveys, the observational stuff we talked about earlier, this is all seen as related to research, relevant to research. It is a sort of research, but it's the research that really informs the sorts of issues that we then want to go and study in a much more deep way. And that's what we're going to start talking about as we go to the rest of the textbook. Okay, cool. So thank you very much. I hope things are going well so far in the course. And yeah, I'll see you in the next lecture. Bye-bye.